People, what is up? Hello. Thank you for your patience. You are in for a treat because we've got the definitive AI search manual guide, and we got none other than Mr. Mike King himself to walk you through it. How's everyone doing today? Looks like we have very much an international audience. Mike, you see any faces you recognize? I see Francine on our team is in there. Hey, everybody. Do people know who you are? I guess you'll introduce yourself, but I won't. So my name's Garrett Sussman, marketing director of iPullRank. Mike, you wanna take it away?
Sure, yeah. I'm Mike King. I'm here to make some of you guys mad today, just so you know. And that doesn't bother me because that's where we are in this journey that we're sharing in this SEO community. So, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so we are iPullRank, literally the best SEO agency and really the only relevance engineering agency in the multiverse. And before we get into this, I do want to say a couple of things because there's been a lot going on in my life that's been really interesting. So for anyone that wasn't here, we threw our first conference called SEO Week. We had 40 of the best speakers in the space, and we also had a gentleman by the name of Busta Rhymes that performed at our after party. And you know who else performed? Me. For those of you that don't know, I used to make music for a living. I cut my hair because I couldn't beat those allegations that I was Will Reynolds, and he's grown his hair out. So I've got to do something to differentiate myself. So anyway, at SEO Week, I realized that I didn't want to have to win over crowds anymore. And so what I realized is like I got to make a hit record so people just show up knowing that I'm great. So I went and worked with a guy named Scott Storch. For anyone that doesn't know who that is, he's the producer behind hits from like Beyonce and Justin Timberlake and so on. And Scott Storch had very humble beginnings. He is from Philadelphia, like I am. He used to be a member of the Roots. He quickly switched into making music for bigger people and scored $100 million fortune. And was at the top of the A list in the early 2000s. He also famously lost everything. But I went to his house and, he's clearly got some things back. He lives on like really high in the building. He's got his cars parked in his living room. It's one of the craziest things I've ever seen. But what was fascinating about that experience is that I was around a whole bunch of people that like just believed they could do anything, and they did. And I kept just being like, "Hey, I'm thinking of doing this," and they were like, "Oh, you should do that." And it just made me realize that we're in this space. I mean, I always generally feel like I can do anything, and that's not really reflected back to me by many people in my life. But it was this really interesting experience where I just realized, like, yo, we can all do anything, especially as it relates to AI. Like, there's so much cool stuff we can be doing and making, and we as SEOs really have this opportunity to do bigger things. And I'm giving this to you in the context of my music career, but if you need it in a business context, go read the book, The Magic of Thinking Big. It's the same sort of idea, right? So with that said, let's get into it. SEO is deprecated. That's how I feel. And again, that's going to piss off a lot of people that are here and that are not here, but I actually don't care. So, we all know that AI overviews are causing traffic losses. And this is a report that I pulled from Wikipedia a number of months ago because their analytics data is public. And so when ChatGPT first came out, you would have assumed that Wikipedia would have lost a ton of traffic. As you can see here, that's not necessarily true because this blue line represents when ChatGPT rolled out, but you see that the traffic trend to Wikipedia actually increased, which is probably a function of the fact that a lot of people just know that there's hallucinations and they were looking to verify the information. But this red line represents when AI overviews rolled out. And you'll notice that that trend started to drop significantly. So we've all seen the studies that show that AI overviews are reducing CTR by 34.5%. And I love to say I told you so because I predicted this 2 years ago in an article that I wrote for Search Engine Land, where we modeled out what the impact from AI overviews would be. And it was between 20 and 60% that we expected to see for, most sites. And that's what we're seeing right now. And in fact, a lot of the things that I talk about in that blog post are exactly what we need to be doing now. And I'm just going to continue to reinforce the things that I've been saying for 2 years. Also, or I definitely complain. I know a lot of us complained to Google about them not giving us any real information of what this impact was going to be. And we all saw that, traffic has been dropping, clicks have been dropping. And we've also been seeing things like, conversions going up in a lot of spaces. And so after that complaint, when we were in Mountain View at Google I/O, they did make an update to the documentation to say like, hey, measure your traffic beyond just visits and so on. So I don't know if you guys should thank me or be mad at me, but choose your own adventure. So yes, we're all generally seeing a trend that looks a lot like this, where we're seeing less traffic, but more qualified because there's more conversions happening. We're seeing when AI overviews are showing up that the traffic is going down. But at the same time, SEO is kind of having this blockbuster moment. And what I mean by that is, back in the day, back in 2000, Blockbuster had the opportunity to purchase Netflix for 50 million. They got laughed out of the boardroom. Now Blockbuster no longer exists, and Netflix is worth 200 million. So SEO is doing that same sort of thing where they're just trying to be like, no, nothing is changing. It's all just SEO and what have you, right? But the reality is that traditional search is melting down, because back in the day, or not even back in the day, a year ago, if you got more rankings, that meant you got more revenue. If you got more content out there, that means you ranked for more keywords, which meant you got more revenue. You made more pages, you got more traffic. But that relationship is no longer a one-to-one or even a one-to-many at this point. It's like you can do more and you might get traffic, but you don't necessarily know. And we know that across everything that we're seeing, clicks are declining. Like you see the data from the various sources, whether it's Datos or SimilarWeb, they're all effectively saying the same thing. Clicks are going down. But what we're also seeing is that the traffic from large language models or from AI search is becoming more valuable. We're seeing more conversion activity coming from them as well. But big picture, people are still having this argument about like what we call it. Frankly, it's GEO. That's what the market decided, because SEO could not get itself together and figure out like what we wanted to call it. We had the opportunity to say to this space like, hey, here's what this is. And we spent the last year just infighting and being like, no, it's AEO, no, it's GEO, no, it's all just SEO. But then you have the market deciding like, hey, it's GEO. You have people like Andreessen Horowitz writing articles about it. You've got, the journalists that are starting to pick it up and talk about it using that term. So we missed that moment. We no longer get to decide what it's called. It is called GEO. Let's move on. What we do at iPullRank, though, is relevance engineering. That's going to sit above any search channel. It doesn't matter which channel it is. We operate doing relevance engineering, which is the confluence of AI, content strategy, digital PR, UX, and information retrieval. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying it's SEO. I'm saying it's information retrieval, because, we have a very deep understanding of how things actually work. And if you do SEO, like, you're just really a power user of Google, right? Like, things like advanced search operators, regex, how to, write htaccess rules or whatever. You don't necessarily know how a search engine actually works. And so I really believe at this stage, you really need to understand that, because things are moving so quickly. And to that end, I also believe that SEOs need to evolve, right? Like, there's a lot more that we need to understand as a community. Whereas historically, it's been like, oh yeah, I've got intuition. I think it works this way, so we're going to do things this way. I think at this point, we really need to rely more on statistical rigor and leveraging as many data points as we can get our hands on, and figuring out like what actually yields success. So, one of the key distinctions between how we do things and what SEO historically is that SEO is very much like a checklist culture, right? Like, you have an audit checklist and you're like, oh yeah, we look at these 30 things and, your page titles are over 60 characters. That must be wrong. But the reality is that, even with the page title thing, following that best practice doesn't necessarily do much for you. You've got to really be testing beyond things, doing lots of experiments, and leveraging an understanding of how things technically work to figure out what those hypotheses need to be. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of like new roles start to emerge. At iPullRank, we've always had a role that we call the SEO engineer that is very much the middle ground between like being an actual developer and being a really strong technical SEO. We've also had content engineering be a focus for a number of years as well. And we're starting to see more and more people hiring roles that are similar. So for generative AI, I mean, just the reality is that we're going to need to upskill and continue to upskill because there's more and more things that just keep emerging. There's more and more ways that this content is being considered and sliced up and used and so on and so forth. Now let's talk about the state of AI search and why we're actually here. The reality is that users never actually wanted 10 blue links. They always wanted the Star Trek computer. They wanted the ability to, talk to a computer and get it to do a thing or give them an answer and what have you. And this has been codified recently over the last like few years in a paper by Andre Broder, who's the guy who came up with the navigational, informational, transactional taxonomy for search. And he wrote a paper called The Delphic Costs of Web Search. And he talks about the idea of there being access costs, cognitive costs, and time costs that are just way too high. So ultimately, they are trying to do things that align with what the users actually want. And there's a quote from Markham Erickson, VP of Google, from an article in The Verge about a week or so ago. He said, user preferences and what users want is also changing. So instead of factual answers and 10 blue links, they're increasingly wanting contextual answers and summaries. And it's so funny that he said people don't want factual answers. But in any event, they are going more in this direction, which also means that the search journeys are going to be messier than ever. It's not going to be as linear as we thought, although that's been true for a while. But it's going to get even worse because people can have these more conversational user journeys. And there's going to be a lot less like pogo sticking as well. Um, Funny like, oh no, Christopher, not funny like, haha. Less pogo sticking as well because, users don't have to do multiple clicks and like synthesize information in their head. Because think about it, right? Like you clicked like, let's say 1 to 3 results on any given SERP, and then you're like, cool, well, I understand this component. It didn't really understand what my information need was, so I've got to like, generate another one. And then they effectively do this across a series of queries and then synthesize the information in their head. But you may land on an article and you're like, this isn't what I want, so you bounce back. But now what Google is doing is effectively giving you all that information in one shot. And the only reason that people are, doing this, like when they click through, and not the only reason, but one of the main reasons that people click through is to kind of like verify the information. And that's part of why they are doing so much in the citation world, because they found in the study that people trust it more when there's citations, even if they don't click through. But data is continuing to indicate that less people are clicking through. We're seeing that in the jump shot data, less than 50% of users are actually clicking. That's going up even more for news sites. I mean, I feel really bad for any publishers. Like, I don't really have a good answer for you for what to do aside from like, hey, do more for Google Discover, because as it relates to classic organic search, you're just not going to get many clicks at this point. But what we're also seeing, and this is a study that came from the Pew Research Center, is that only about 1% of users are clicking links in the AIOs. Of course, Google refuted this study because it's in their best interest to do so. But we know, like, there are very few clicks coming from these. And so we're also ultimately relearning how to search as users, right? Like, it's far less about that Orwellian newspeak where it's like, okay, how do I condense what my information need is into like 5 words or what have you? Users are realizing like the more specific the information is in their query, the more specific the response will be. But we're also seeing that the user queries are not evolving anywhere near as fast as what we're seeing in, a ChatGPT, right? Like we're still seeing much shorter queries going into Google than they are into the other surfaces. More and more data is coming out to showcase that the quality of clicks from AI search has increased dramatically. It was just a year ago far smaller in the conversion that it drove than what you're seeing from classic search. But again, we're seeing more and more high quality visits coming from these channels, even though it's nowhere near the volume of visits. We're also seeing that 52% of users are using LLMs, about 34% once a day. We've seen that AIOs have grown dramatically, especially if we look back to March. The great decoupling, we're seeing that change even in the last couple of weeks as well. And I'll talk about that with the num equals 100 parameter thing. But we're also seeing that the referral traffic is dramatically lower from these channels than what we're seeing from classic organic search. So even if we look at AI mode versus Google search, and despite that, we're seeing that there's growth in referral traffic from the other channels. So things like ChatGPT and Perplexity and so on. But end of the day, Google is still the most dominant force here. And I believe that ultimately Google will win this war between the ChatGPTs of the world for a very specific series of reasons. One, Google has that proprietary data advantage, and I know that they may be losing that to some degree with the remedies that have come out of their DOJ antitrust trial. But I'm sure that'll be an appeal for a number of years, and by the time that Google has to give it up, the way that they define it internally may be so different that the data that they give to these third parties may not even be that valuable. And then Google also has their own chips, so they don't have to, wait on NVIDIA to ship them things. They're not really beholden to that. They can just make whatever chips that they want and make them very specific to their needs. And then, they have multiple billion user products. So the feedback and also their ability to rapidly deploy things is going to give them learnings much faster and more validated learnings than anyone else is going to get. So effectively, they can sit around and just watch Chat or OpenAI do whatever it is that they do, and then take those features and then add them to Gemini. And so the inertia of everyone using Gmail and Docs and so on is just going to natively have them using these products. So I think long term, they're going to be the winners. But there's also a lot of studies that showcase that the slop is growing very fast as a function of all this AI stuff as well. There's a study from Stanford about how when they looked at 300 million documents, so many of them were just LLM generated. And we're seeing that, AI generated content is 16.5 of the results in the SERPs at this point. And this is from a study from Originality AI. But we're also seeing studies indicate that AI usage doesn't impact rankings negatively. And I've said this for a number of years as well, that Google cannot reliably look at whether or not something was AI generated as a single signal to determine whether or not it should rank or it should not rank. If anything, they've got to use a combination of signals. And one of the signals that is very clear from AI content, especially when it's bad, is that it has a high bounce rate. And so if they use that and a series of other signals that they use, and then also look at it in terms of whether or not they believe it's generated content, then that can be the signals that they can use. But just because it's using AI search does not, or to me, it's AI generated content does not mean that it's inherently not going to rank as well. But another big problem, and I've also been saying this for a while, is that OpenAI attacks Google on two fronts. One, it's effectively a giant UGC campaign that can pollute Google's index. And two, it's also just a new modality of how people are getting their information needs met. So we're seeing that over time, the index is going to be polluted. And so Google has had to counteract that by indexing things a lot less. And that's why you've been seeing things are harder to get indexed when it's like a page type that is very similar and doesn't really have value. There's predictions that 90% of online content is going to be AI generated by 2026. So again, Google is going to have to continue to be smarter in how they determine what they index. And then there was our AI heist, or the SEO heist that Jake Ward pulled off temporarily, where people were, or he was out there just bragging about how much traffic he was able to get just by using generated content. So of course, Google is going to have to continue to figure out what to do here. But it's not just a function of whether or not it's AI generated. And then another big problem is hallucination. It's still not a solved problem. We're seeing that GPT-5 has a 1.4% hallucination rate based on this study that was run. Gemini 2.5 Pro has a 1.1% hallucination rate, whereas Gemini 2.0 Flash has a zero point 0.7. So it's not a solved problem even with the grounded text, and it's definitely something that um, is going to continue to need to be worked on. And I know there was that study that came out of OpenAI a couple of weeks ago where they realized like it's a function of the need for the solution to have an answer, or the AI or the language model to have an answer. But other studies just continue to indicate that there's a huge misinformation problem here. This study showed that AI search is wrong 60% of the time. We've seen that ChatGPT has hallucinated new features for a company called SoundSlice, and SoundSlice kept getting users expecting that it would work a certain way. And so as a result, they built the features that ChatGPT said it was going to have. But again, more and more studies are coming out saying that there are hallucinations everywhere. And we're also just, there's just a reality that search is still an unsolved problem. So Google is going to continue to have to work through like how do we meet these complex user needs. There's still going to be these information gaps that are persisting, even though we have the web scale of information that we can leverage. And so you can expect that Google is going to continue to want to integrate with more third parties, whether it's through A2A or MCP or what have you. And search is going to continue to profoundly change. So it's really disheartening to watch the SEO industry be like, no, nothing has changed. You just keep doing what you already do. I think right now is the moment that we need to reconsider everything we're doing and figure out where the gaps are so that we can actually move forward and do things that are of value. So let's talk about how AI search works. I know I've put a lot of information out there on it. It's a lot to read, so I'm happy to just break it down over the next 10 minutes. So the headline is that AI search is a shift from deterministic to probabilistic rankings. And to some degree, search has always been, or it has been probabilistic ever since personalization has come into play, but it's reasonably stable, right? Like, unless there are queries where there's breaking news, things don't change too much between each load of the SERP. With AI search, there can be instances where you get a different answer, right? Like you can run a SERP multiple times and they may not cache the AI overview. You may get a different response. And so, what I mean by deterministic versus probabilistic is the content doesn't come out the same way that it goes in. It gets interpreted, it gets reasoned on every time that the response is generated. So the core pattern behind that is retrieval augmented generation. That's effectively when you're combining a large language model with a search engine. And what happens is they encode your query into a vector representation, and then they're doing vector search to figure out a series of candidates, and then they re-rank those, and then they're effectively grounding the response in those passages, and then they're generating that response. So when we talk about the historical version of search, how it's known, when we talk about things like TF-IDF or BM25, those are representations of what's called lexical search. And so in that instance, you're taking the user's query, you're breaking it down to a series of tokens called n-grams. So if a query is 5 words long, it can be broken into, a 4-gram, a series of 1 grams, 2 gram, and a 3 gram, and you're retrieving what are called posting lists based on all those n-grams, and then you intersect the list of documents and you rank them based on TF-IDF basically. And of course, Google introduced things like PageRank and so on. And they're all different like measures that are added to that score to ultimately generate that list of ranking documents. So semantic search is more about using AI to understand meanings. So you're effectively taking the documents, plotting them in multidimensional space based on these higher dimensional embeddings, and then the embeddings that are of the documents that are closest to the query embeddings in multidimensional space are considered the ones that are most relevant. So hybrid retrieval is when you combine both, because there are situations where the lexical performs better because it identifies those words and their incidence rates uh, better than the embedding search, because you may have some difficulty in understanding the relationship between the query representation and the document representation. More often than not, you end up finding through like synonymy and so on, documents that otherwise wouldn't have ranked in there. So what you're doing is you're combining it from both sides, you're re-ranking it, and then doing the grounding based on that. So what Google introduced was the transformer, which really allowed us to better understand context, and where early versions of vector embeddings like word to vec didn't really have the context. So if you use the word bank in different contexts, you didn't really understand the difference that's there. And so where Google has continued to evolve is that they have vector representations of everything. They have vector representations of authors, websites, entities, users. And so they can plot all that in the same multi-dimensional space to get an understanding of those relationships. So content of all formats can go in that same embedding space, and they can rank videos and audio and documents all together effectively. What Google has introduced more recently is what's called personal context, where they have vector representations of everything that the users do in the Google ecosystem. So they can learn from pages you look at, they can learn from your Gmail, they can learn from what you've purchased, and then they can use that as a filtering mechanism for what content that they ultimately show you. Now, historically, all this has been discussed as like single vector representations. What they've been moving into over the last year is something called Movera, where they have multiple vectors that represent things, and they can effectively have higher fidelity of that representation. So when we talk about AI overviews, the way they work, there's a number of ways that they're laid out in the different patents, but one of the ways that they work is they effectively generate the answer, and then they look for documents that can corroborate what they've said in that answer. And then they ultimately, you know, are returning that response based on all the passages that they found in the query fan out stage. So with AI mode, that works a bit different in that, it's basically a longer pipeline of the same sort of idea, but there's more reasoning stages that go into that as well. But the whole idea is that there are more passages and more pages that are considered for more queries as well. And so when you're looking at these, the differences between the two, it really comes down to how much content is being considered based on how many queries are being considered. And so when you think about the query fan out, let's say the example here is the best half marathon training plan. That's going to be broken down into a bunch of different synthetic queries that represent both implicit and explicit needs that the user has, and also related queries and so on. And then we also map those to, or route those to different types of content based on what that query might be looking for. Now, the thing that you have the most control over is trying to rank for as many of these synthetic queries as possible. And then you kind of lose control because all those passages then go through a series of these reasoning chains to determine what they ultimately want to use to then generate that response. So, the way that this content is ultimately discovered isn't just from crawling. It can be from crawling, for most of these systems, not Google or Bing systems, but from a ChatGPT or Perplexity, they all request those pages in real time. And so it's really important to monitor that, because the pages that get requested the most are the ones that you can consider for kind of, I want to say manipulating, but like impacting the responses for these different AI channels. And then there's also the AI or API based access, where you have like these structured feeds or these license fees. That's when people are doing these direct deals with, these different channels. And so when they generate these responses, again, they're expanding the query, they're then routing it to different content types, they're retrieving the content, then they're selecting what content they want to use, they send it for synthesis, and then they generate that response. So the query / prompt is where everything starts. And, historically on the lexical side, it's like, cool, we've got the query, let's look for the documents. And there may be some small expansion of keywords across the topic cluster, but in this case, there's a lot more subqueries and there's a lot more sources that it's pulling from as well. And so when they expand the queries, then it goes to this process of identify the intent for the queries, the slot identification, the latent intent projection, where they're going to compare it to other queries in multidimensional space. Then they may rewrite these queries and diversify them. And then there may be also speculative sub questions that actually happen as well. So they break the query down to a series of needs for different information domains, not domains like, subdomain for a website, but information domain. So, like, what is the category for the subject matter? And then what are the subcategories? And then what are the types of tasks that the user might be doing based on these different queries? And then there's also risk and safety profiling that they use as filtering as well. Excuse me. So for slot identification, there may be different information requirements that they have. So there may be explicit ones that are said directly in the query, and then there may be some that are inferred from the queries that are being used as well. And then there's latent intent projection, where they just say, cool, let me take these queries, let me put them in multidimensional space. What are close matches semantically as well that we also want to use as part of this? And then they may rewrite the queries and further diversify them based on what they're seeing other people use in other queries that they're doing, because there's a whole matrix of query representations that Google has from the different searches that users are doing. And then they're using that to say, like, okay, well, this one's related. Let's make sure that we also include that too. And then there's speculative sub questions, like what else that the user might be asking based on what their initial question is. So if we're going back to best half marathon training plan for beginners, one of the questions might be, what should my nutrition be like? Or how long does it take to train? Or what are common training mistakes? And then they route all these individual queries to the type of content that they might want. So it might be like a gear checklist or a training plan. That could be an e-commerce site, or it could be a coaching blog, or a stretch routine might be a video. So there's very clear expectations for what they're looking for based on what they think makes the most sense for that query. So then they map it to these individual sources, and then from there they have like a retrieval strategy, because if it's something requires them to ping an API, that costs more than just running a lexical BM25 analysis to pull the content. So they're thinking very smartly, because they're doing this at web scale. There may be billions of queries that they have to do this for. So as an example, if we're looking at like a finance term and the query is best high yield savings account for 2025, that's one where they might want to hit a financial data API, or they might want to look at some bank product pages or what have you. But that routing is where you get a better understanding of what you can do. Because if you don't have content that fulfills, the expectation for one of these subqueries, then that's not going to be an opportunity where you're likely going to rank in an AI overview. And so at that point, they want to select the content based on that synthesis, based on like what is going to fit into a large language model response very easily. And so what they're measuring for is extractability. Like, can they easily select this chunk from this content and then use that information as part of a response? And I'm hesitant to use density because I know the history of the word keyword density in our space. But the idea is that we've got to have high evidence density, meaning that you have verifiable claims in your content in order for them to select it and then use it as part of that response. And so to that end, you want to be like very clear in what you're saying. Like, you want to say something like, as of February 2025, this is the tactic for a runner that's a beginner who can do this in 3 miles or what have you. You don't want to have like ambiguous language. And so authority and corroboration really comes into play here, because they're looking for that information to be consistent across multiple sources, but they're also looking for like the net new information that may be easy to extract and valuable in this response. And in a lot of cases, freshness can be really important too, because if it's like content that has a temporal element to it, they look for something that is dated, has like a clear, um, indication that it's been updated and what have you, so that they can rely on that information. Um, so like using dates in your structured data can be really valuable. Using a date on the page can also be really valuable. And then the last component of this is that they also run things through safety filters. So if you're saying something that specifically for like a your money your life topic that is questionable or something that hasn't been vetted, then they are not going to use your information. And so the question comes up like, why does good content not get used? You may have something that's really well written for a person that is vague in certain places, isn't being very specific, isn't using data in a way that's really easy for them to select it from your content. So it may get skipped because of that. And so when you build your content, you want to make sure that you're having these uh, elements that are very extractable, using lists, using, of course, headings, having paragraphs that are short and to the point, not really talking about a variety of subjects. And so, to that end, what that ultimately means is that one, you want to have multi-dimensional content, meaning that you want content across a variety of different channels. You want it to be beyond your site. You want to cover specific intents across a piece of content, but across multiple pieces of content. And you also need to be measuring this effectively as well. So let's get into more detail about all this stuff, because the common question is like, oh yeah, this is just SEO, right? Deep breath, deep breath. Okay. So one thing before I get into any of this, my data-driven beliefs do not require any of you to agree with me. So if you don't agree, go for it. But I actually don't care. So one of the first things that people say is that, AI search uses retrieval, so SEO matters more than ever. Yes, you're right. That is true. But it also presupposes the idea that the SEO community has kept up with advancements in retrieval. And it frankly has not, because our best practices, our software, and our common understanding of how things work is so out of date, right? And so a lot of people that do good SEO that is in alignment with all this sort of stuff, absolutely, you're doing the right things. But there are also some nuances where we need to be thinking about this more strategically across more channels that do change what it is that we do. So here's the other thing. There was a study that ZipTie did where they basically found that if you're in the top 10 for a query, that gives you a 1 in 4 chance of appearing in AI overviews. I cannot offer a service where what we do gives you a 1 in 4 chance. I need something that's closer to like an 80 to 90% chance that we're going to move the needle for you. So then there are people that say things like, oh, show me what you do for GEO that you don't do for SEO. That is so deeply disappointing to me that the SEO community still struggles with the distinction between strategy and tactics. You can do something using the same tactics that has a different strategy. Full stop. Here's an example. What is social media marketing if it's not just channel specific content strategy? That's literally what it is. It is you are doing a content strategy with the nuances of a different channel in mind. But despite that, it is its own category with its own line items, with its own budgets. So AI search is exactly the same thing. And also you can do things in or standard organic search that makes rankings drop or visibility drop in AI search and vice versa, because each of these channels cares about different things. So ChatGPT is using Bing and Google as its indices. The URLs are still being requested in real time. And the nuances of how it's treating that content is different from what Bing does. Even though Bing Copilot, although there is multiple copilots, it's still using its index with ChatGPT, but doing it differently. Perplexity also uses Bing and Google, but it puts citations in the foreground. It's treating things differently. So if you don't have a different strategy for each of these channels, what are you doing? Another one I love. I didn't do any of that fancy GEO stuff, and I'm in ChatGPT in 24 hours. Okay, well, show me that for any competitive prompt or query space. Just show me. Here's another one I really love. Chunking is a scam. Okay, let's look at this. Here's my original paragraph, and I'm targeting the keywords machine learning and data privacy. And when I do cosine similarity between that paragraph and those two keywords, I get a 0.6481 and a 0.6948 respectively. Now, when I split that into two paragraphs, you'll note that the cosine similarity goes up for both paragraphs. Shocking. But chunking is a scam. If we agree that this is how relevance is measured through some function of comparing a query or a prompt, the vector representation for that to the vector representation of the passages, if we agree that this is how these things work, which we've just demonstrated from these white papers, patents, and so on. And also, if you do anything from a RAG perspective, this is how all these things work. How is it that chunking is a scam? Here's the thing. You don't have to have an opinion on everything to be a thought leader. You can just be a quiet person when you don't know. Here's another one I like hearing. You don't have any case studies to prove that this worked. Sure, I do. What you're telling me is that you don't. So here's an example. In early days, of course, we've only really been able to get clients to commit to doing this stuff since the beginning of the year. But for one of the vehicle sales companies that we work with, their AI search visibility is up 2x. And specifically and that's across all channels like that we track for. But specifically in ChatGPT, they're up 661%. AI overviews are up 330%. And this really comes down to all those efforts that we talk about, like restructuring content, optimizing accordingly, all the relevance engineering things that we talk about. Now, for one of our other clients in the telecommunications space, they wanted to grow their AI overviews. And we're like, cool, we can do that. And of course, in March, they all grew for everybody. But nevertheless, we did these same efforts and they continued to grow after that. So again, we're seeing that, year over year, they're up 253% on that. So until we see our software catch up, what everyone is talking about is an idealistic form of SEO that most people aren't doing, right? Like if you're one of those like Python SEOs that's been playing with these sort of things for a long time, then yes, I'm sure, yes, you have been doing a lot of this stuff already. But the majority of people that are doing SEO are not doing that. And so until we have software that does more of these things for us, that's not going to change. So what do we actually do here? Like I said, relevance engineering is what we call what we do here at iPullRank. And so it's really a four-part process. It's content auditing with extractability and AI readability in mind. It's doing the semantic and latent intent research. It's restructuring and augmenting content to make it easier to extract these components, and also making sure that we have visibility across a variety of different content types, not just on the website. And then it's also testing and iterating through what I call like AI simulation. So to identify the gaps, first step is going to be, pulling the rankings in the landing pages, vectorizing the passages, comparing that against other people's passages, and then, improving it effectively. And so, the tool that I built for identifying the synthetic queries is Qforia. A lot of people are forking it, which I think is great because that just means that collectively as an industry, we are all looking to level up. And what it does is it uses Gemini 2.5 Pro to extrapolate from the query that was inputted. It also tells you the type of synthetic query it is, and then what the intent is for the user, and then what the reasoning was why it chose that query. I have quietly updated Qforia over the last, week or two or whatever. And what it has added is the routing for that synthetic query. So basically, like, what is the content type that is expected? So is it an article? Is it a checklist? Is it a buyer's guide? Is it a video? That sort of thing. And it also gives you the reasoning why it does that. Because ultimately, what we need to lean into is this omni-media content strategy. Now, there's been some feedback that, Qforia data isn't real enough for you. Like, you can't trust what Gemini is doing because it's probabilistic. Fine. If that doesn't work for you, we can do it the other way, where basically what we do is we take the URL, the landing pages in the citations, and then you look up what they rank for, and then you intersect those keywords to figure out like what are the commonalities for what actual keywords that users are actually using um, that these pages rank for. And so in this example, the query that I put in is like, what is Star Trek? And so what you're seeing in this graph here is the keywords that appear the most across all the citations. And then effectively, you could use those as your targets instead. But ultimately, what I'm saying here is that we need omni-media content strategies, meaning that you need to have content for video, you need to have content on your site, you need to have content that is, audio or whatever. And then you also need to think about like UGC and things like that, and your digital PR, all those sorts of things. Like have that visibility because it's pulling from across that ecosystem. And then measurement also needs to evolve. The way we're stratifying it is into 3 different buckets. So input metrics, channel metrics, performance metrics. Performance metrics are the things that you've always used, like traffic and rankings and so on. Channel metrics are going to be things like share of voice, citation rate, citation quality, and so on. And then input metrics are things like passage relevance, entity salience, bot activity, rankings for synthetic queries. And we're also building new dashboards that align with that as well. And then we're also tracking content performance on a very granular level as well, going back to a lot of the sort of metrics that Dwayne Forrester talked about too. And then on the UGC side, everyone's talking about Reddit, but it's not just Reddit. It can also be Quora. It can also be LinkedIn posts, getting, publishing on those and so on. And then for the content that we're creating, making sure that it's entity rich, the language is embedding friendly. You're having like qualifiers and locations, things like that, all those related entities. That I would say is look at the entity graph from like things like Wikidata and so on, and then look at the related um, entities and basically incorporate content that's expected on those related entities. Structured data, I'm not going to argue with y'all. Y'all can argue with amongst yourselves as to whether or not it's being used. I know it's used, so we're going to keep using it. And then for the on-page elements, because SEO loves a checklist, make sure that your heading hierarchy makes sense. So don't use like, multiple H1s. Don't use them out of order because they are using those as the boundaries, and they're also using those to indicate, what is important. Have clean semantic content, have an open robots.txt, do your topical clustering, SEO basics there. Chunking, layout aware chunking is really what we need to be thinking about more so than semantic chunking. But, you can use both for doing your analysis. And again, it goes back to like breaking up those paragraphs into smaller, very focused paragraphs to make them easier to extract and so that they improve on the relevance measures. And we've got a tool for that you can use called Relevance Doctor that will basically show you in a layout aware way how your scoring looks like. And then you can make your adjustments. But from then, it's really about like how do you better optimize those individual passages. And that really comes down to things like semantic triple. So using these sentences that are structured as subject, predicate, object, and it just becomes a lot easier for them to extract the copy and then use it. So write sentences like this, a lake house provides weekend relaxation and rental income potential for homeowners, rather than saying the pros of buying lake houses are many. Like be very specific in how you're using it. And then give those data-driven insights as well, like use those numbers because it's easy for them to extract using numbers from sentences. And then, again, just avoid ambiguity in all the content that you're generating. We have a whole flow chart of how you can review the content. It is some of it is like the qualitative things that you're looking for, but some of it is also from a perspective of like, is it clear? Is it ambiguous? Those sorts of things. And then, you also want to be simulating your rankings because we have access to all the same things that these systems are using. Like we have the embeddings that Gemini uses, we have the embeddings that OpenAI uses. So we can effectively simulate what a change is going to do from how they're measuring relevance against these prompts and queries. Okay, one more thing on rank tracking. So, you may or may not know that Google dropped support for num equals 100. I've been a proponent of rank tracking being broken for a very long time. It represents a context that no user actually has. And to that end, it's also always been to some degree probabilistic as well. But it's really funny to me that people get so concerned with the biases of the outputs and the probabilistic nature of outputs for AI search and the quote unquote rank tracking or visibility tracking there, but that's always been a problem in classic rankings as well. And so I'm hearing that a lot of tools are going to limit rankings to the top 20, which to some degree makes sense because the re-ranking doesn't really go beyond the top 20, but there's also value in having all 100 as well. But at the same time, there's a lot of other dumb things that need to be fixed about rank tracking before we even consider all that. Like, why are we tracking, keywords that have a 30 monthly search volume when you're tracking that daily? That 30 monthly search volume is your rank tracking. There isn't a user actually looking for that. The bigger deal is that effectively Google is changing the denominator on us by making this change, and it makes everyone think that their average position went up significantly over this last week. And of course, Google is doing a lot more on the anti-scraping side of this, so you can expect that this is only going to get worse. So what I would say is pay attention to the companies that are moving quickly. A lot of them are being very thoughtful, but this also may be an opportunity for you to think about rolling your own solution. And if you are, I would recommend checking out FetchSerp, which is an API for pulling rankings data. And they've also got an open source tracking tool. I know Paul Shapiro has his ranking berry. There's a lot of things out there that you could be using where you have control over what it is that you're tracking. All right, so just wrap this up. We're iPullRank. We've got our AI search manual. It's 20 chapters of pure fire that goes in complete detail on all this sort of stuff. You can grab it here. Also, SEO Week 2026 is coming. It's going to be even bigger than before. And that's all I got. What questions do y'all got for me in these last 4 minutes?
What? That was ridiculous. I hope everyone's feelings are not hurt. I know mine are not. We've got a lot of great questions in the chat. Too many to go through, but we got a few minutes, so let's go. Thank you, everybody. This has been awesome. So Mark wants to know if you can share some of the points in favor of schema markup for GEO.
No, I'm not having an argument. Use it or don't. What else we
Next,
got?
would you say chunking is the same or similar to passage indexing from Sophie?
It is the same. Yeah. I mean, passage indexing is where all this started. So that was Google's shift from looking at the page as one big thing to then looking at it as individual components instead. So, yes, chunking is effectively passage indexing.
Okay, John wants to know what tools, models, or platforms do you currently use to calculate cosine similarity between prompts and keywords in multidimensional space?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got a lot of internal tools for that, but it's basically just vectorizing using the mixed bread embeddings and then comparing against the query by just doing a simple cosine similarity calculation. I wrote a blog post on how you could do that in Google Sheets as well. So it's just like, the same sort of calculation once you've got the embeddings. If you prefer, you can use Gemini embeddings. For most of my use cases, I find that Gemini embeddings are not as great as far as like the retrieval, but ultimately we should be comparing against what it is that Google is doing. And so, for like production cases, we do typically use those.
Awesome. Christopher wants to know, is it possible to see some relationship between how an LLM might fan out query your site and content via user agents and log files?
Um, you wouldn't be able to do that because it's going to fan it out and then look at a variety of pages. So, like, let's say The only way you would know is if they looked at a bunch of your pages, right? Like you could see in your log files that you got hit, let's say like 5 times in like a second or whatever. You would know that that's all, or it's likely that's all related to like the same response. But there would be no way to look at that unless we had, you know, log files for like the whole web.
Cool. Brian wants to know, do you think agencies that offer both traditional SEO and GEO, AI SEO, et cetera, packages are pointless?
What? I don't think I understand the question. Is it if they offer services that are AI SEO and classic SEO, it's pointless?
I think so.
I mean, it depends on your focus, right? So, like, if your focus is identifying all these synthetic queries and creating content across that matrix and doing it in multiple formats, and you're calling that SEO, sure, you don't need both things. But if you're just doing classic SEO, which is like, hey, your page title is 60 characters, and we got to make sure that we get links from external sources, and you're doing that in hopes that you rank in AI overviews and ChatGPT, you're not doing what needs to be done.
Too many good questions. Okay, I guess this will have to be the last one, but Jan wants to know, how do you balance entity-rich text for AI with dryness that can come with it and thus can be less readable for actual people? How do you make your
I
content
get it.
interesting
I
for
get
people?
it.
Okay.
I
Okay.
mean, it's the same problem that we've always had, right? Like you gotta account for users first, and you've got to also write for a machine. Um, and I used to work with Devin. He called it the poetry of SEO. It's just like writing a haiku. Like you're very constrained in the format of a haiku. It's 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. But that's no excuse for it to be dry, corny, or boring. It just means that you need to, as you're writing or when you do your edit, go back through it and say, okay, let's account for these things. And that's one of the values of AI because you can use a large language model to get that done. Like you can have the large language model go through and say, like, hey, use more semantic triples in this, or make this less ambiguous, or use data points or whatever for this.
There you go. Okay, well, thank you, Mike, so much for your time. I hope you all got a lot out of this. I will send out the replay after along with the deck. Obviously, hit us up if you need Relevance Engineering services. We cover everything, and we have a few slots. I know we're getting to the end of the year, like about to hit Q4, where budgets open up. So don't wait on that. Try to get into us because we have a certain amount of bandwidth through 2025, and going to 2026, we're booking up already. So thank you all. See ya.